It was a serene morning in the neighborhood, the kind where everything seemed to be in perfect balance. The sun had just started to rise, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns. Birds chirped from the trees, and the distant hum of a lawnmower was the only sound breaking the tranquility. The protagonist, a middle-aged homeowner who had lived in the quiet suburban cul-de-sac for over a decade, sat on their porch with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, taking in the familiar view. Their eyes rested on the massive oak tree that towered in the front yard, its broad branches reaching out like protective arms. It wasn't just any tree. It was a symbol of the house itself, a testament to years of growth, resilience, and pride. The tree had been there long before the protagonist, and it would be there long after. Or so they thought. Suddenly, a strange feeling swept over them. The calmness of the morning felt almost too perfect, like the silence before a storm. They tried to shake it off, but there it was again, a prickling sensation at the back of their neck. They glanced across the street, toward the house of the infamous HOA member, Karen. Her property was always pristine. Too pristine, in fact. Perfectly manicured hedges, immaculately swept driveways, and that unforgiving, judgmental gaze she often cast on anyone who dared deviate from her rigid vision of order. Karen had been quiet for a while, but the protagonist knew that silence never meant peace when it came to her. And today, there was something in the air, something about the way Karen's blinds were drawn just slightly open, her face barely visible through the crack. The protagonist couldn't help but feel watched. It was almost as if Karen knew they were observing her. A wave of unease hit them. Sipping their coffee, the protagonist glanced back at the tree, which now seemed to stand taller, its gnarled branches stretching into the sky, as if trying to shield itself from unseen forces. Was it just their imagination, or had the tree grown even more imposing over the years? The sight was comforting, but the growing tension between them and Karen was hard to ignore. After all, it wasn't the first time she had made veiled threats about the tree. The complaints had started months ago, initially just a passing remark at a neighborhood BBQ, but then they grew more frequent and more insistent. The last letter had arrived last week, another formal warning, this time from the HOA itself, demanding the tree be trimmed or reduced in size due to alleged aesthetic concerns. It wasn't the first time Karen had tried to get rid of something she deemed unsightly, but the protagonist wasn't going to give in, not without a fight. Suddenly, they caught a glimpse of movement. Karen, now standing at her window, her gaze locked on them through the sheer curtains. The chill that ran down their spine was impossible to ignore. Karen's eyes were cold, calculating, as though she were already plotting her next move. The air grew heavy with the tension, and the protagonist knew something was coming. What Karen would do next was anyone's guess, but one thing was certain. The peace they had taken for granted was about to shatter. The sun had barely begun to climb higher in the sky, casting a soft glow across the neighborhood. Yet, despite the beauty of the morning, a sense of dread hung in the air. The protagonist tried to shake off the nagging feeling that something was about to happen, but their stomach twisted with every passing minute. The last time they felt this anxious was the day Karen had first approached them about the tree, before the HOA had gotten involved. It was just a week ago, during the annual neighborhood barbecue. Karen had cornered the protagonist near the grill, her voice laced with sweetness that was all too familiar. "Such a beautiful tree," she had said, eyes narrowing as she took in the thick branches that stretched over the sidewalk. "But have you considered how it might affect the view? You wouldn't want the neighborhood to think you're not following HOA guidelines, would you?" The words had been a thinly veiled threat, but the protagonist hadn't taken the bait. Not then. They'd smiled politely, dismissing her comments with a wave, and pretended to enjoy the rest of the evening. But deep down, they knew it wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to give up on something so trivial, especially not when it gave her an opportunity to flex her power. And now, here they were. The mailbox creaked open with an ominous sound, and the protagonist froze, hand hovering over the envelope that had arrived that morning. It was official-looking, stamped with the HOA seal, and addressed in Karen's unmistakable handwriting. Their hearts skipped a beat as they ripped it open, the paper inside crisp and cold. The letter read, "Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that your tree, which has long been a point of concern for some neighbors, is now officially in violation of HOA regulations. You are hereby ordered to trim or remove it within the next 14 days. Failure to comply will result in fines and further action. Sincerely, Karen Henderson, HOA Chairwoman." The words hit like a slap to the face. The protagonist's hands trembled as they reread the letter. Violation of regulations. The tree had been there for years, and they had followed all the city ordinances, yet here it was, Karen's final play. It was personal now, and she had the power of the HOA behind her. But the letter wasn't just a warning, it was a direct threat. The last line made it clear. If the protagonist didn't obey, there would be consequences. The dreaded fines, yes, but also something far more sinister, the further action. What could that mean? And why did Karen's signature feel like a harbinger of something even darker? The protagonist stared at the letter for a long time, their pulse racing. They had prepared for this, of course. But the coldness of the words on the page made their blood run cold. What Karen was asking wasn't just unreasonable, it was borderline illegal. There were no grounds for removing the healthy tree, and everyone in the neighborhood knew it. But Karen didn't play by the rules. She made her own. They stuffed the letter into their pocket, determined not to show fear. But deep down, a gnawing sense of dread crept over them. This wasn't just about the tree anymore. It was about power, control, and humiliation. As the protagonist stood there, eyes locked on the towering oak, a strange rustling sound caught their attention. For a split second, they thought they'd heard something. Maybe the whisper of a branch shifting in the breeze. But when they looked again, the tree was still. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive. But then, just as they turned to head back inside, the sound came again. This time, it was unmistakable. The crunch of footsteps on gravel. The protagonist froze. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up. Someone was coming, and they knew exactly who it was. Karen. And she wasn't coming for a friendly chat this time. The days after the letter arrived felt like a countdown to something inevitable. The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful suburban life was unraveling, thread by thread. Every morning, as they drank their coffee on the porch, they found themselves eyeing Karen's house across the street. Her blinds were always drawn at just the right angle, and she was often seen pacing behind them, as if waiting for something, or someone, to make the next move. It was clear she was up to something. But what? The protagonist tried to carry on as usual, but the tension was suffocating, like a storm cloud hanging just above their head. They had spent hours researching HOA rules, consulting legal experts, trying to understand how Karen could possibly make a legitimate claim against the tree. The tree had been there for decades, part of the landscape, a reminder of the neighborhood's history. There was no law that said it needed to be cut down. Yet Karen's threats kept escalating, each one more menacing than the last. The protagonist couldn't help but notice how their peaceful neighborhood was beginning to change. The usual chatter over fences had quieted, replaced by whispers and sideways glances. The neighbors, who once waved cheerfully as they passed by, now hurried inside their homes, avoiding eye contact. Even the mailman seemed to be delivering packages with a noticeable haste, his usual friendly greetings now replaced with an awkward nod. It was as though everyone knew something was about to go wrong, but no one was willing to say it out loud. That afternoon, as the protagonist stood by their kitchen window, the sensation hit them again, the unnerving sense of being watched. The air felt thicker now, charged with an energy that couldn't be ignored. The soft murmur of wind rustled through the leaves of the tree, but it was the silence around it that caught their attention. There was no chirping of birds, no distant hum of lawnmowers. It was as if nature itself had paused, waiting for the inevitable clash that loomed. A knock at the door broke the stillness. The protagonists jumped, their heart pounding as they swung the door open to find a stranger standing on the porch, a man in a sharp suit, holding a clipboard. His eyes flickered with the faintest hint of nervousness, but he smiled politely. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said, his voice smooth but tense. "I'm with the HOA. I'm here to discuss the tree." The protagonist's stomach twisted. The letter had already made it clear what this was about, but seeing the formality of it all, this man's air of authority, made everything feel real in a way the paper hadn't. "Karen sent you?" the protagonist asked, keeping their voice steady despite the pulse racing in their veins. The man hesitated, his gaze darting around as though ensuring no one was watching. "Well, she's just concerned. The tree has become a liability, you know." The protagonist's eyes narrowed. "A liability? How?" "The tree has been here for over 30 years. It's perfectly healthy." The man nodded, but his eyes flickered to the side nervously. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am. I don't make the rules." But the words liability and rules were enough to make the protagonist's mind race. Why was Karen sending this person instead of dealing with it herself? Was she trying to distance herself from the situation? Or was she preparing for something worse? Before the protagonist could respond, the man's voice dropped lower. "Karen has more pull than you realize, and she doesn't like to be defied." The implications hung in the air like a dark cloud. As the man handed over a second, more official-looking letter, he gave one last, lingering look toward the oak tree. "You really should consider trimming it, for everyone's sake." The door closed with a soft thud as the protagonist backed away, the second letter trembling in their hands. Outside, the wind picked up, sending a gust of air rustling through the branches. The tree seemed to sigh under its own weight, as if it understood what was coming. And for the first time, the protagonist couldn't help but wonder, how far would Karen go to get what she wanted? The morning light streamed through the windows, casting a golden hue over the protagonist's kitchen, but the warmth of the sun felt distant, like a false promise in a world that was slowly spiraling out of control. The second letter from the HOA was still on the counter, its contents searing through the protagonist's mind like a brand. Trim it or else. But the "or else" wasn't just a threat anymore. It felt more like a guarantee. The protagonist had been preparing for the worst, but nothing could have prepared them for what happened next. It was a quiet Wednesday morning when the distant roar of a chainsaw cut through the stillness of the neighborhood. The sound was at once alarming and unmistakable. Without thinking, the protagonist rushed to the window, their heart thudding in their chest. There, in the driveway across the street, were two men in hard hats, already revving the chainsaw as they approached the tree. Panic surged through the protagonist's veins. They rushed out the door, calling out to them, "Wait! Stop! What are you doing?" But the men didn't respond. They merely glanced over their shoulders, barely acknowledging the protagonist as they continued to circle the oak tree, assessing its height, its branches, the angles of the cuts. The chainsaw roared louder, deafening, as it revved in preparation. A familiar figure appeared at the edge of the driveway. Karen. Her smile was sickeningly sweet, but there was a sharpness to it now, a coldness that seemed to freeze the air between them. "I told you it would happen, didn't I?" she said, her voice smooth, almost too calm. "The tree's got to go. The HOA doesn't make exceptions." The protagonist's stomach churned, the audacity, the defiance. "This isn't legal, Karen. You can't just—" "Oh, I can," Karen interrupted, stepping forward with an air of finality. "The HOA has already issued the mandate. And as for you, well, I think you'll find that resisting isn't going to work out in your favor." As she spoke, one of the workers started the chainsaw, a sharp, menacing buzz that made the protagonist's ears ring. It was too late to stop them now, too late to protect the tree. It felt as though the world was closing in, the once towering oak becoming a casualty of power, greed, and petty politics. But just as the chainsaw bit into the bark, the protagonist noticed something strange. The way the tree's branches seemed to creak and groan, as if protesting the impending destruction. The winds began to pick up, swirling around the tree, making the leaves rustle like whispers in the wind. For a brief moment, the protagonist thought they saw something, an unnatural shimmer, a flicker of movement in the air above the branches. Then, in an instant, everything went wrong. The chainsaw screamed as it cut into the wood. The tree seemed to shudder, its bark splitting with a deafening crack. And before anyone could react, the ground trembled. A massive branch, thicker than any of them anticipated, snapped free from the trunk, its trajectory clear and deadly. It plummeted toward the driveway, straight for Karen's prized convertible, parked just a few feet away. Time seemed to slow, the branch descending with horrific precision. The protagonist's breath caught in their throat. Karen's eyes widened in disbelief as she turned, but it was already too late. The branch crashed onto the convertible with an earth-shaking thud, the impact so intense that the entire vehicle crumpled like paper under the weight. The windshield shattered instantly, the sleek metal frame buckling under the massive force. A torrent of leaves and debris rained down, surrounding the wreckage as the dust settled. The men with the chainsaw stood frozen in shock. Karen, her face a mask of disbelief and fury, gaped at the destruction. Her prized car, her symbol of superiority, was now nothing more than an unrecognizable heap of twisted metal and shattered glass. The protagonist could barely breathe, a mix of awe and horror flooding their senses. They had expected something to happen, but not like this. This was no ordinary accident. This felt inevitable. Karen's voice broke through the silence, shrill and furious. "What have you done?" The protagonist felt a strange sense of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by a rush of guilt. They hadn't intended for this to happen, but Karen had pushed them too far, cornered them with her arrogance. And now, there was no way to undo the damage. The workers slowly backed away, unsure of how to proceed. The air was thick with the weight of the moment. In the distance, the faint hum of a car engine could be heard as a neighbor drove by, their curiosity piqued by the spectacle. And through it all, the tree stood tall, its branches still swaying as if they had achieved some kind of victory. But at what cost? The protagonist knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. The air was thick with disbelief. Karen stood frozen, her mouth agape, staring at the wreckage of her once pristine convertible. The men with the chainsaw had retreated to a safe distance, their eyes wide with uncertainty. No one dared to speak. But Karen's silence didn't last long. Her shrill voice cut through the heavy silence. This is your fault. You planned this. I'll have you arrested. You've destroyed my car, my property." Her hands trembled with fury as she gestured wildly toward the mangled heap of metal. The protagonist stepped back, heart hammering in their chest. They hadn't meant for this to happen. They hadn't wanted to see Karen's car demolished. But the branch had fallen with such force, as if the tree itself had sought retribution. They hadn't had time to stop it. This is criminal," Karen continued, her words growing more venomous by the second. "I will make sure the HOA takes action. You'll pay for this. Mark my words." The protagonist's stomach twisted in knots. They had never seen Karen this unhinged, and the realization hit hard. The situation had spiraled far beyond anyone's control. But Karen's threats didn't seem to faze the protagonist this time. Instead, a rush of adrenaline coursed through them, their mind racing with the realization of what they had just witnessed. The tree had acted on its own, in a way that defied reason. The branch had fallen with an uncanny precision, as if it had known exactly where it needed to strike. Could it be mere coincidence, or was something more sinister at play? The protagonist's thoughts were interrupted by the distant wail of sirens, growing louder by the second. The neighbors had already started calling the authorities. The tension in the air only thickened as the sound of approaching police cars pierced the morning calm. Karen, now trembling with fury, shot the protagonist one last look before she stormed toward her front door, muttering to herself, "This is far from over." As the first police car skidded to a stop in front of the house, the protagonist was left standing in the middle of the chaos, a mix of confusion and fear bubbling inside them. They knew the law. Destruction of property, even accidental, was serious. But how would they explain what had happened here? The tree had acted with a force that couldn't be ignored, yet who would believe that a tree could strike back? The police officers, two men in their early 40s, stepped out of their vehicles with the confidence of those who had seen it all. They assessed the scene quickly, their eyes moving from the wreckage of Karen's car to the towering oak tree that loomed over the yard. "What happened here?" one of the officers asked, his tone cool but probing. The protagonist opened their mouth to speak, but before they could say a word, Karen was there, her voice rising in an almost hysterical shriek. "They destroyed my car. They did this on purpose. It was all part of some plan to ruin me." The officer turned his gaze toward the protagonist, clearly seeking their side of the story. The protagonist hesitated for a moment. How could they explain this without sounding like they had lost their mind? The events that had unfolded felt like they belonged in a movie, not in real life. But before they could respond, the second officer raised a hand, cutting through the tension. "Hold on a second." He turned his attention to the tree, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the massive trunk. "Is it just me, or does this tree look unusual?" The protagonist's heart skipped a beat. The officer's words echoed the growing unease that had taken root in their own mind. Something wasn't right about the way the branch had fallen. It had almost been deliberate. "I don't know," the protagonist said cautiously. I didn't want this to happen. I tried to stop it, but the tree." Before they could finish, the first officer interrupted. "We'll need to investigate. Stay here for now. Don't leave the property." The tension in the air grew unbearable as the officers moved toward the tree, inspecting it closely. The protagonist watched, their breath caught in their throat. Something about the way the officers were studying the tree, their narrowed eyes, their careful movements, sent an icy chill down their spine. And then, just as the silence seemed to stretch on forever, the second officer spoke again, his voice low. "There's something strange here. Look at this." The protagonist's gaze followed the officer's pointing finger. He was pointing to the base of the tree, where deep, jagged scars marred the bark. At first glance, they appeared to be natural, but upon closer inspection, it became apparent that the marks weren't caused by wind or decay. They were deliberate gouges, scratches as if someone, or something, had been tampering with the tree for a long time. The realization hit like a jolt of electricity. This wasn't an accident. Someone had been messing with the tree. And the more the protagonist thought about it, the more they realized that maybe, just maybe, the tree wasn't as innocent as it appeared. The discovery of the strange gouges on the tree sent a ripple of unease through the protagonist's chest. The officers were already talking quietly to each other, their murmurs unintelligible. But the sense that something far beyond the ordinary was happening grew stronger with every passing moment. The wind had picked up again, rattling the branches, almost as if the tree itself were aware of the scrutiny. Karen, meanwhile, had retreated inside her house, likely planning her next move. Perhaps a call to her lawyer, perhaps another attempt to manipulate the situation to her favor. Her earlier rage had given way to a cold, calculating demeanor. The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The second officer, still focused on the tree, turned back to the protagonist. His brow furrowed in thought. "I've never seen anything like this. These scratches, they look almost deliberate. But why here? Why now?" The first officer, a grizzled veteran with an air of indifference, muttered under his breath, "Trees don't make mistakes. Someone's been messing with this one. Maybe Karen's got more to do with this than we thought." The words were enough to send a jolt through the protagonist. messing with the tree. It hadn't occurred to them before, but what if someone had deliberately been tampering with it all along, setting the stage for this moment? "Look," the first officer continued, his voice harder now. "We need to get to the bottom of this. Whether it's Karen or someone else, it looks like someone's been planning this. And you," he pointed a finger at the protagonist, "need to stay out of this mess. Just let us handle it. Don't make this worse." But the protagonist's mind was already spinning. They couldn't let this go. The gouges in the tree weren't random. They were too precise. Someone had been preparing for this moment, and the protagonist was right in the middle of it. Is there any chance that someone's been trying to provoke the tree? The words were out before they could stop themselves, the absurdity of the question hitting them even as they said it. The second officer paused, looking at them as though they had lost their mind. But then his eyes flickered back to the tree, something shifting in his gaze. "It's a stretch, but we'll look into it. Can't rule anything out yet." The protagonist's thoughts raced. Could the tree somehow have been tampered with? Could someone have, in some twisted way, trained it to react? It sounded insane, but nothing about this situation felt normal anymore. And as they watched the officers huddle together, exchanging a few more hushed words, the protagonist knew that the truth was far from simple. Then, as if on cue, there was a loud crack from the tree. A branch that hadn't been disturbed suddenly splintered with an unnatural force, sending a cascade of leaves and small twigs to the ground. The sound was sharp, jarring. The protagonist flinched, instinctively backing away, but the officers didn't react. They were too focused on the damage to Karen's car. But that was when it hit them. The tree wasn't just reacting to the chainsaw anymore. It was reacting to something else. The protagonist's pulse quickened. They turned toward the house, where the silhouette of Karen stood watching from her window. Could she somehow be manipulating the tree? Or was someone else behind it? The more they thought about it, the more it seemed like the whole situation was far from over. As the officers began to take down notes, preparing to leave, the protagonist felt a cold chill on the back of their neck. The wind had died down abruptly, the atmosphere stifling. It was as if the tree itself was holding its breath. Then, the second officer approached, his expression serious. "You need to be careful," he said quietly, leaning in so only the protagonist could hear. "I've been in this job long enough to know when something feels off. There's more going on here than you realize. We'll be back to investigate, but don't do anything drastic. Not yet." Before the protagonist could respond, the officer turned and headed back to his car, the other following close behind. But as they drove away, their car tires kicking up dust in the street, the protagonist was left standing there, staring at the oak tree. The hairs on their arms stood up as they noticed the faintest shimmer, almost like a ripple, over the surface of the bark. As if something, or someone, was watching them. The silence was deafening now. No birds, no wind. The neighborhood seemed suspended in time. Then, a single leaf fell from the tree. It fluttered to the ground, and for a moment, it seemed almost too delicate, too intentional. The protagonist bent down to pick it up, and as their fingers brushed the leaf's surface, a sudden, jarring thought gripped them. This isn't over. Someone, or something, was behind this. And they weren't done yet. The hours stretched by, thick with tension, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the front yard. The protagonist stood frozen, staring at the tree with growing unease. The officers were gone, but their words lingered in the air. The promise of something off gnawed at the protagonist's mind. Something about the tree's behavior, the gouges, and the way the branch had fallen. It all felt deliberate. But deliberate by who? And for what purpose? Karen's furious face flickered through their mind, her cold threats echoing in their ears. She had been so quick to blame them, but could she really be the one behind it all? The tree wasn't just a casualty of the HOA dispute. It felt like it was actively participating in the chaos. The evening air was cool now, a crisp wind stirring the leaves, as though the world itself was bracing for something. The protagonist's pulse quickened. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something critical, something right in front of them. The tree. It had to be the key. Determined to find answers, the protagonist stepped closer, eyes scanning the trunk for any more clues. The tree's bark had an almost unnatural smoothness, as if someone had carefully tended to it over the years. But there was no sign of life, no insects or animals scurrying about. Everything about it felt unnaturally still. Then, in the fading light, something caught their eye. An indentation in the bark that hadn't been there earlier. A small, shallow groove, almost like a symbol, hidden beneath the thick layer of moss. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was definitely there. Without thinking, they reached forward, tracing the pattern with their fingers. The groove felt cold to the touch, and as their skin made contact, a shudder ran through them. A sudden gust of wind blew through the branches, making the tree groan as if it were alive. The protagonist froze. The sound wasn't just the creaking of wood. It felt like a warning. But a warning of what? Before they could pull their hand away, the world around them seemed to shift. A low rumble vibrated through the ground, and the tree's branches rustled violently, as though stirred by an unseen force. The protagonist stumbled back, fear flooding their chest as the air seemed to thicken, growing heavier by the second. Then, just as quickly as it began, the rumble stopped. Silence fell over the yard, suffocating and deep. But the tree had changed. The bark that had once felt so smooth now appeared, warped, twisted, as though it were trying to push against something. The faint groove they had touched now seemed to pulse with a soft glow, the lines of the symbol slowly becoming more defined. The protagonist's breath hitched in their throat. What the hell was happening? A voice, soft, like a whisper on the wind, seemed to emanate from the tree, chilling the very air. The protagonist's heart hammered in their chest as they tried to make sense of the sound, but it wasn't a voice they could understand. It wasn't even human. It was something older, something ancient. And in that moment, the protagonist understood. The tree wasn't just a bystander in this bizarre ordeal. It was part of it. The tree had been a witness to something dark, something that had been buried long ago, a secret that had been waiting to come to light. The protagonist felt their body tremble, the weight of the realization sinking in. The tree had been tampered with, yes, but not by Karen. Not by anyone from the HOA. The gouges were part of something much older, something deliberate. As they backed away from the tree, their eyes darted around the yard. Every shadow seemed to loom closer, every rustle of wind more sinister. The house, the car, the people, everything seemed to blur, as if the protagonist were caught in a dream or a nightmare. A sudden crash broke through the tension, and the protagonist spun around to find Karen standing on her porch, her face twisted in fury. She held a small, glowing object in her hand, some kind of pendant, its light pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. The object hummed with an eerie power that sent a chill down the protagonist's spine. Karen's voice cut through the air, thick with malice. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." The protagonist took a step back, their mind racing. What was she holding? And why had she come back out now, after everything that had happened? But before they could speak, Karen's eyes locked onto them, and something cold flashed in her gaze. "You think you've won, don't you?" She took a step forward, her voice low and dangerous. "This is just the beginning. You've awakened something. And now, it's coming for you." As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, the glow from the pendant intensified, casting long shadows across the yard. And the tree, with its pulsing symbol and groaning branches, seemed to shift once more, almost in response to Karen's words. The protagonist's breath caught in their throat. The stakes had just risen far beyond what they could have ever imagined. Whatever was happening, it was no longer just about a tree or a petty neighborhood dispute. It was something far older, far more dangerous, And now the protagonist was at the center of it. But one thing was clear. This was just the calm before the storm. The air crackled with tension. The pendant in Karen's hand pulsed with an otherworldly glow, its light casting eerie shadows that danced across the yard like phantom figures. The protagonist's heart hammered in their chest, the sense of danger thickening with every passing second. Karen's words echoed in their mind, a dark promise that sent a chill down their spine. You've awakened something, and now, it's coming for you. What had they done? What had Karen done? The tree, the strange markings, the unnatural reactions, none of it made sense, and yet the overwhelming sense that they were standing at the epicenter of something ancient and terrifying was undeniable. The pendant's glow grew brighter, and with it, the world around the protagonist seemed to tilt. The very air shimmered, as if reality itself were warping. The tree, once still, now seemed to hum with a deep, resonating energy, its branches swaying despite the lack of wind. The gouges in its bark pulsed like a heartbeat, and the symbol etched into the trunk began to shift, the lines twisting in patterns too complex to comprehend. Karen, her eyes gleaming with something far darker than mere rage, took a slow step forward, the pendant held out like a weapon. Her lips curled into a smile, one that was more chilling than anything the protagonist had seen before. "You don't understand," she said, her voice low, almost reverent. "This tree, it's not just a tree. It's a gate, a doorway, and you've just kicked it open." The protagonist's mind spun. A doorway, a gate. What was Karen talking about? The pendant in her hand was no ordinary piece of jewelry. It was alive, its energy pulsing in time with the tree. And in that moment, the protagonist realized the truth. Karen wasn't just a frustrated neighbor. She was part of something much darker, a cult, a secret society, something that had been working for years to unlock the power of this tree. Before the protagonist could respond, the ground beneath their feet began to shake, a deep rumble vibrating through the earth. The tree groaned, its bark splitting along the grooves, and the air grew thick with an unnatural energy that pressed down on their chest. The protagonist stumbled, barely able to keep their balance, as the tree's branches began to twist and writhe like serpents. "Do you see now?" Karen's voice was gleeful, filled with a sense of triumph. "You've set it free. The tree has been waiting for centuries, and now it will take what is owed." The protagonist's breath caught in their throat. What was owed? The tree's groaning grew louder, its massive trunk beginning to tremble. Then, with an earth-shattering crack, the ground split open near the base of the tree. From the gaping fissure, a tendril of dark mist began to rise, swirling like smoke from an ancient, forgotten realm. The air grew colder, the darkness creeping into every corner of the yard, choking out the last remnants of daylight. The protagonist's heart raced, a feeling of utter helplessness sweeping over them. What could they do against something like this? The tree had become a conduit for something ancient, something that was now slipping free from the bonds of time. "No!" the protagonist shouted, taking a step back, their eyes darting between the tree and Karen. "What have you done?" Karen's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with a manic light. "I've done nothing. It was you. You set it free. You woke it from its slumber. You." But before she could finish, the tendril of mist began to solidify into something darker, something alive. The mist twisted and curled, forming the shape of a massive, shadowy figure, something too dark and monstrous to comprehend. Its form shifted in the swirling fog, and its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with a fierce, otherworldly light. The protagonist's knees buckled, their body trembling as they backed away from the horrific sight. The creature's form was impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and jagged, like twisted branches of the very tree that had caused all this destruction. It moved with an unnatural grace, as if the shadows themselves obeyed its will. "You've done it now," Karen whispered, her voice a mix of fear and awe. "It's here." The creature's eyes locked onto the protagonist, its gaze freezing them in place. There was no escape. The power of the tree had awakened something that could not be controlled. The protagonist could feel the weight of the ancient forest bearing down on them, its darkness suffocating every breath. And then, as if it were a whisper carried on the wind, the creature spoke, its voice a deep, resonant rumble that sent shivers through the protagonist's bones. "You have released me, and now I will take what is mine." Before the protagonist could react, the mist surged forward, its tendrils lashing out like whips, reaching for them with impossible speed. The pendant in Karen's hand began to glow brighter, its power intensifying. But it was clear, Karen had no control over this creature. The tree had been its prison, its cage. And now, it was free. With one final, deafening crack, the ground beneath the protagonist's feet shattered. The last thing they saw was the figure of the creature lunging toward them, its jagged limbs outstretched, and the terrified expression on Karen's face as she realized she had set something unstoppable into motion. The world went black.